Hello, welcome to Dominion. I'm Ian, and today we're talking about Giulia de Gasperi's role and functions of the Italian Hall in Dominion. So, this is a very small, but in a positive way, article. Has to do with a community that would often get overlooked in Cape Breton, an ethnic community that sort of falls outside of the ones that sort of seem make larger, grander claims to being sort of founding communities like English, Mi'kmaq, Scottish, Irish, Acadian. But Cape Breton has been part of its industrial heritage has been a multicultural place for 150 years, and that multiculturalism isn't exclusive to the urban center of Sydney, and Dominion is an excellent example of that. Um, but again, it's a population that we don't necessarily consider very often, and um, in part because it has been about 100 years of assimilation. We don't see language as prominent as we might. It's certainly not protected language in the same way that Gaelic and French and Mi'kmaq is. So it emerges often. Why am I using this sort of impersonal? The explicit named, framed identity of Italian Cape Breton emerges at particular moments. In Dominion, often during Seaside Days, which is their summer festival, and in the hall where I'm sitting right now becomes quite the place for it. They have the Italian supper, it's a fundraising dinner, and so on. In Sydney, the Italian community there has a similar pasta dinner that is part of Action Week festivities. But sort of only at key moments does does sort of this identity tend to sort of be expressed in as focused a way on sort of not simply within the group, but communicated outwards by the group to the larger population. Unlike, again, these sort of communities of dominance, like the hegemonic communities of the founding five. Maybe I should start coining them as the founding five. So this community, the Italians in Dominion in particular, are from the northeast of Italy, from Treviso. So I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that many of the Italians from Sydney, the ones who sort of settled in the Whitney Pier area, they're from slightly southern parts. But these are northern Italians, basically, a rural, agricultural part of Italy, and that is the population that most of the Dominion Italians came from, and lured here by recruiting agents post First World War to work the mines. So basically, come to the land of opportunity. Obviously, Europe had just undergone the Great War, and immigration was always an issue from Europe, probably from the 1850s through to the let's just say through to the 1970s. And you also had just this ongoing boom demand in industrial Cape Breton, this need for bodies, this need for labor. And so recruiting agents would go and find communities. An entire community could basically be transplanted out. First, it was men. Then they would, like as often happens when immigration is initiated by labor recruitment, it's men arrive first and establish perhaps small little enclaves. And if they have families, it might be first brothers and then extended family or wives and even parents, by that matter, if sort of the seeds have been planted. That's how the origins of the community, at least in Dominion. And just over there's a block that was known as Little Italy, Station and Henry Streets, along Mitchell Avenue. And the hall is basically in front of Mitchell Avenue. And it was sort of typical, as you would imagine, most immigrant communities to be in 1920s and 1930s in industrial areas, where the men spent most of their time working in the mines, And then leisure activities. Women would be tending to domestic labor, tending to children, tending to small gardens. They sort of domestic horticulture and so on. And so, most of the time, immigrant communities look to replicate the patterns of sociability that they had before. So, if there was a certain division of genders in the and sort of clear demarcation of public and private space in the home community, that's something that would easily be replicated here. But replicated within a context that is not it's not identical and is as multicultural as Dominion might be, is not something that is immediately found. Everything from, a contemporary industrial town is arranged differently from a centuries-old European agricultural town, even in terms of streets being on grids and so on, and how houses might have emerged over time. So the hall became part, sort of one of the first indications of the strength of the local community. They were granted some land that they bought from the diocese itself, from the Catholic diocese, and there was a community effort, like happens elsewhere, community effort to construct a building, a meeting place. And the role of the ethnic hall in general in North America, and in Cape Breton in particular, or at least in Nova Scotia in particular, is worth taking a time to sort of consider. Because they largely occur in communities, perhaps as modest in size as Dominion, but even in large, the massive metropolises of central Canada. They are opportunities, sort of, in a way, what's the word I'm looking for? Not unnatural, but contrived and deliberate means of trying to create some form of space that is markedly different from the multicultural space around them, not as a matter of resisting assimilation, but as a matter at the very least of allowing for certain forms of celebration to take place. So they might run, you would have churches that would be specifically both denominational, like Catholic, but also ethnic, as it were, so an Italian Catholic. That was resisted in Dominion, in part because perhaps the community wasn't large enough to sustain an entire church on its own, but also the priest was worried that the Italian community wouldn't assimilate into the larger Catholic community, and assimilate not in a negative erasing of identity, but in terms of creating a Catholic community. If it were split in two, you'd have two smaller Catholic communities as opposed to, one large, thriving, potentially stronger, united one. You wouldn't want to introduce sort of factionalism within the community, especially if Catholic and Protestant tensions are already tight. But, where does one go and do one's vernacular celebrations? It's one thing to have the church to perform the wedding or the christening, but where do you go to celebrate the wedding? Where do you have the wedding dinner? Where do you have that space that is not controlled by the institution of the church, but is rather controlled by, and therefore the celebratory roles of the community itself? And so halls allow for that to happen. So there's some wonderful studies of halls as a role, and there's lots in Cape Breton as well. There's the and legions function the same way, because yes, first there's this multicultural aspect of the hall that should be sort of paid attention to in terms of how communities enter and create a place of their own where they can gather together and celebrate and celebrate the culture that they wish to retain, wish to continue in its performance. There's also the issues of just having social space to begin with. And one of the reasons that these halls were not monocultural, they might have been defined by Italian, or they might have been defined by like the Lebanese and Syrian communities that we have in the Cedars Hall in downtown Sydney, just off of Townsend. But you have instead, you also have Nova Scotia's weird liquor laws, where social spaces like bars or pubs were drastically limited, really until like the late 1960s. And what were the conditions for having a a liquor license were rather difficult, but halls were one of those places. So halls became a place of sociability independent of whether they were places of marked ethnic identity. So you have like the French Club in downtown Sydney. You have legions. I mean, the role of the persistence of the legion as sort of the center of a social space in the Maritimes largely has to do with, well, there's nowhere else to drink, so let's drink here. And it's not about alcoholism, it's about sociability, and it's about gender. So it's also about male social gathering spaces when you didn't have things like a village town square like you might have in some kind of almost stereotypically idyllic European agricultural community like you would have had in northern Italy, or the sociability that you might have in agricultural communities in terms of where a private house is fundamentally a public, where people are sort of encouraged to move in and out of people's kitchens and so on, like you might see in the outport communities in Newfoundland, where someone's kitchen is fundamentally a public space, and the rest of their house might not be, but the idea of, we never unlocked our doors. If you don't have that, you need to construct that, particularly in environments that are increasingly urban over time. So you had the Italian community doing that, and it organized its various things. It had a particularly robust social year. It had Italian days. There's this wonderful anecdote that Giulia tells us of, remembering the greasy pole. So again, an imported European tradition of, greasy pole is exactly what it sounds like. It's a pole, it's covered in grease, and then people, teams sometimes, or sometimes on the individual level, struggle to try and climb it. There's usually a prize at the top, and status is accorded, like happens in all spots. Holidays, you could do things like Befana. You could have an Italian form of community celebration, in addition to sort of the broader Christian or the slightly narrower but still broad Catholic. And of course, you could also have these weren't little enclaves. It became a community within a larger community that would communicate. Sorry for using a commune word 3 times in the same sentence. That would be able to, represent itself in terms of, year-round celebrations or yearly celebrations and parades and so on. So it's like, and here's a contingent from the Italian Hall, and so on. One of the things about the hall was its food, and because people would fundamentally, on some levels, certainly in the days when it was, broadly open, like open houses, it would introduce Italian food and Italian suppers, and these would be fundraising suppers for the hall as well, to the I'll just say the Cape Breton audience, but particularly the sort of the Anglo audience, and which was actually one of the things that Giulia points out is a point of a certain amount of contention. And because one of the things I like about the article is that it's not a sort of nostalgic reminiscence. It talks about the genuine issues of immigrant communities. So what you would have is with one of the great tests in domestic arrangements is the expectations of foodways. And if you can read about this in things like the work of Diane Ty, but who does a lot about Atlantic Canadian foodways, but in other contexts as well. There's one of the driving forces in domestic tension and domestic violence is the inability to provide food the way that meets expectations. And so you would have these Italian men who are then marrying Anglo, Scotch Anglo women who couldn't cook Italian food, and there was the tension of needing to them, having their mothers or sisters or relatives come and teach their wives how to cook, in large part because if you had a diet in Cape Breton that was largely potato-based, and for the northern Italian communities, the potato is basically literally pig food. It's the potato is not a crop for food. Genuine tensions about how the two actually get to reconcile. So you have Giulia is speaking about these, at the very least, the narratives of the kind of, when we map the histories of immigrant communities and how they do or don't assimilate, we often focus on sort of the much more public displays. We often focus on things like the construction of a hall, the naming, the marking of geography. We'll often talk about sort of prominent business people and how, like, a community might have named markets, and you can go down any street and it's like, that is a name that is certainly not of the larger population. That is a quote-unquote ethnic name, and sort of a site of cosmopolitanism is the fact that our businesses are as much likely to be named for an Abbas or an Assad or a Schwartz as they are for a McLeod or a McKinnon. So you have those kinds of prominence, but you often don't see the other kind of assimilations, which can be constructive and can work, but sort of take place within the domestic sphere and communities intermarrying and how that reflects. So this is a wonderfully, as I said, it's a small article, but that is never a criticism. It's the idea of let's just take this, fundamentally this one building, this one prominent but modest building in a small town in Cape Breton that has lost much of its economic power and lost much of its population, but still retains this important community role, and how through things like the integration of this building into the larger community, it is now not a landmark simply of the Italian community, but of all of Dominion. The fundraising suppers are not simply for the Italian community, but for the larger Dominion community. And what has emerged is this interesting syncretic style, the Italian chicken dinner, which is syncretic in terms of bringing two different patterns together. It is using Italian foodways to create what is basically a Anglo supper of a protein and a starch and a veggie all on the same plate, as opposed to an Italian meal where things would be perhaps brought to the table and small courses of something served and something served and something served. This is the plate. The plate is a, not uniquely but distinctly Cape Breton way of understanding food, and what has emerged in Dominion is the plate itself. So we don't see these communities represented much except on these festival days. And these festivals like Seaside Days, like Action Week and so on, these multicultural festivals, they are part of the sort of way that the island or the province communicates. You'll see them in guides, but they're not nearly as prominent as the Acadian Festival, and even though St. Anne's Mission it's a much more announced event, even though it's not necessarily as public an event as this. But things like the powwows that now take place, where come on and come to our communities. These are much more local. They are perhaps in many ways they're much more important to Cape Bretoners than these named events. Like Celtic Colors would probably be the best example of it. Gilded colors is recognized as important because of the generation of income, and that isn't necessarily even a cynical thing. This is a prominent and good use of resources. And locals, of course, do attend and like attending, but it doesn't necessarily have that same aspect of tradition. That same thing of this is something that we do and we look forward to, and we don't necessarily frame it in terms of how it might be understood by outsiders. It's how it's understood by insiders. So all of a sudden, this Italian meal shows up in the middle of Cape Breton, and from an outside perspective, that makes no sense. And from an inside perspective, it's like, of course it does. They are a part of this community. And you can just look around. I mean, not in a patronizing way. So many people in Cape Breton have Italian relatives. They have Italian last names. And just as important, it has gotten to the point of assimilation, which is always an ugly word, but on the point of assimilation where traditional Cape Breton food includes the spaghetti supper. It includes lasagna. It includes, of course, pizza, and which are also, various levels of whether they comprise, authentic Italian food from Italy, but they're part of the larger North American Italian diaspora, without necessarily even framing them explicitly on Italian grounds. So I'm babbling, but it's a great article. I highly recommend. 2 thumbs up. And I don't have a huge amount more to say about it. So this is The Hall Was Us by Giulia de Gasperi. Roles and functions of the Italian Hall in the Italian-Canadian community of Dominion, Cape Breton Island, Canada. As always, my friends, I bid you well.